Good afternoon and welcome to Western Sydney Community Forum's interactive live stream. My name is Anita Hanna and I'll be your host for today's session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we're meeting today. And I'm personally on the lands of the Cabrogal clan of the Darug Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I also acknowledge with respect any Aboriginal friends and colleagues who are joining us today. So today's live stream is focusing on digital access and digital literacy, which has become really important during COVID-19. It's a critical thing, and we need to look at digital access and literacy and the role that they will help play in recovery across Western Sydney. Today is part of a series of live streams which Western Sydney Community Forum hosts for stakeholders and community services to look at regional priorities across Western Sydney. But to kickstart our conversation, I'd just like to let you know how you can contribute to today's session because it is interactive. You can contribute and ask questions by clicking the raise hand button on your device and you will join a queue. And we will then invite you to share your question through the voice facility. If you prefer, you can click the Q&A button on your device and type your question, which I will then read out on your behalf. We will do our best to respond to all questions. For those joining us on the YouTube live stream, you can post comments and questions on the stream and they will be shared in this forum. So we will do our best to respond to all questions. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists now so we can kickstart the conversation. I'd like to invite Abdallah Altibi, who's the Multicultural Youth Worker at the Multicultural Youth Affairs Network, also known as MYAN, New South Wales. Welcome, Abdallah. I'd like to introduce Beck Reidy, who is the Centre Coordinator at Bidwill Uniting. And Beck is joining us today and leading a lot of the campaigns across Western Sydney regarding digital access and literacy. Welcome, Beck. I'd also like to introduce Jane Stratton, who is the CEO and founder of the Think+Do tank. And we're very pleased to have you here today. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.
So I might just get straight into the question. So this will be a question for all the panelists, and we might start with Beck. In the COVID-19 society, we are told that the future of working and studying is here, that we will be heading this way into the future. But does the future look the same for everyone? Beck, we'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, obviously not. There's no way it can look the same for everyone. There are many of us who've moved online and do a lot of work from home, but the bulk of my work is engaging with community, especially ones experiencing disadvantage. And there's just no way you can do that from home. The people that we're working with, mostly social housing residents in Mount Druitt, they actually largely don't have access to the internet. So the ABS stats are interesting, and they say that around 20% in the suburbs that we're working in don't have access to the internet. But I would actually argue that it's potentially a lot higher than that. The question that's asked in the census is just about, does any individual in your home access the internet there? So there's a lot of room for, it doesn't talk about whether that's quality internet, whether it's mobile internet. So what we're hearing on the ground during COVID is that no one that we're working with really accesses the internet. There's very few who have been able to engage with us via Zoom for our community meetings or anything like that. So I would argue moving forward that people who are already experiencing disadvantage. This is just one more factor that's going to compound that. It's going to be harder for them to find work. It's going to be harder for them to socially interact if they don't know how to use the things that everyone else is, FaceTime and Zoom and whatever other platforms people are using. So no, it definitely doesn't look the same for everyone, and people are being left behind.
Thanks so much, Beck. I think you raised some really key points there around disadvantage and concentrated disadvantage. And we're looking at whole communities, I think, feeling the impacts. One of the population groups I think that feels the impact are migrant and refugee communities. So I would like to turn to Abdallah just to give us your thoughts on, do you think the future looks the same for everyone?
Coming from a refugee background and working with refugee families and migrants, I would say it's a bit different for some of the migrants and refugee communities. Newly arrived migrants and refugees in most cases are well acknowledged as part of the Australian community. However, they do not have the resources and the tools that Australian citizens have, or migrants who have arrived longer time ago, which would have equipped them with the needed skills to access equitable opportunities in terms of work and study. As a result, I would say the impact of COVID-19 would be greater and in most cases negatively on the newly arrived refugees and migrants, as they are still at a learning stage to gain the different skills they would need to work and study online and from home.
Thanks, Abdallah. And I'd like to turn to you, Jane. You work a lot in Fairfield, which is made up of lots of migrants and refugees, as well as those areas where we see acute disadvantage. From your perspective, do you think the future looks the same for everyone in this space?
Definitely not. And I echo what Beck and Abdallah have shared already. I think that Beck talked, I guess, about the sort of multi-dimensional layers, I guess. It's sort of layer upon layer that exclude people from equal participation. And I guess unless we really name the systems that are locking people out and the forces that are making it difficult for people to access potentially democratising forces like the internet can be a tool for inclusion, it can be a tool for connection and empowerment. But if you don't have access, or if you can't afford reliable access, if you don't have a device that lets you do what the internet is capable of doing, and if you don't have the skills to be on there confidently, you know, it's not capable, just by virtue of how the system is set up, of delivering the promise for people who are excluded. So I guess that's why we feel that, you know, focusing our efforts on looking at what it means to include more people in the promise of the internet is a really valuable and important thing for us to do.
Absolutely. And I think that leads very well into the next question, which I'd like to again turn to all of you, which is about what role does digital access and literacy play in how well Western Sydney will recover post-COVID, if there will ever be a post-COVID, but certainly there will. And what role will digital access and literacy play in that recovery? I might start with you, Jane. We might mix it up.
Go backwards.
Yeah.
Sure. So, well, I feel something I know I've spoken to Beck about before is this idea that COVID, the arrival of COVID, has sort of ripped a Band-Aid off, or rather parted the curtain. You know, you can sort of see vaccines into what's really been happening. I've heard other people talk about it as an X-ray. It's getting inside what is actually going on. And when we asked families and school children in particular to start learning from home, I think it's not that people have suddenly become disconnected from the internet. I think what COVID has done is show us the extent of how deeply so many households in Western Sydney and beyond, in a low income setting, how disconnected they are. So in terms of if others want to join me in that thinking, I guess the question is the recovery in a way in a post-COVID world, if it's to look different, if we're to change the way that people, the inequity that COVID has so clearly shown us, we need to make an investment not only in the affordability of the network access, but also how affordable it is to own a device, and an investment. At the moment, the government invests at an adequate level, you could argue, in the digital skills development of people who are 50 and older. What we think we need is a package that actually looks at families and people under 50 who do not have well-developed digital skills, and make an investment in that capacity in the community.
Okay, Abdallah, what role do you think digital access and literacy play in how well Western Sydney will recover post-COVID? We've heard from Jane, and that's some key things around what we need to be focusing on and investing on and making sure people are literate digitally and have access. What would you be able to add to that in terms of how we will recover?
I believe having access to technology assets and the ability to use them is part of the recovery post-COVID-19 in Western Sydney and all around the world too. But equally as important is developing such skills in digital literacy to be able to work from home, as this is highly likely going to be the norm for the so-called foreseeable future, and will also be normalized for a certain period once the pandemic ends. So many businesses may take work from home approach as it has proved more efficient, however, just as effective. So digital literacy and its availability will be fundamental to restoring Western Sydney's functioning economy, particularly as businesses and institutions attempt to adapt the work from home approach to work effectively with face-to-face interactions and in the post-COVID-19 context.
Absolutely, I agree with you there, and I'm pretty sure Beck will likely agree. And you know, that there's so many population groups in Western Sydney, migrants and refugees. We have communities facing, I guess, socioeconomic disadvantage in areas like Bidwill. You know, Beck, what role do you think digital access and literacy has when you think about the communities you support in how they'll be recovering post-COVID?
Yeah, I guess what I would say, just building on Jane and Abdallah's points, is that we need to start now. We don't know how long COVID's going to go on for, and we don't want to kind of save this for post-COVID recovery. What we're beginning to understand, I think, more broadly, is that this is actually essential. It's as essential, and we've talked about it in our group with, you know, with Westerly, that internet access and the ability to use it is just as essential these days as water and electricity, and it needs to be seen that way. So if we're talking about concentrated disadvantage in areas of social housing or of migrant and refugee communities, there need to be local grassroots solutions on the ground for those people, but built with those people involved in the process. You know, we need to be thinking about these things now. And I guess one of the main thrusts of our message from Westerly, our newly formed coalition, is that we need to be looking at this holistically. The things that we've talked about, access to the internet, affordability of the internet technology, and the know-how to use it, so digital literacy, they're kind of three prongs that can't be taken apart. Even if you have one, if you don't have the others, there's no point. Even if you have 2 out of 3, there's still no point. They actually need to be tackled together, and that's kind of one of the things that we're arguing. And if they are to be tackled together, it means we need to be having really strong and robust dialogue, not just with government, not just with telecommunications, but with education, with telcos, with other sort of business providers in the digital space. we need to have a broad ranging dialogue across all of those parts. It needs to be coordinated.
And invested in. So I think that it's not just a market mechanism, you know, around pricing. There needs to actually be a policy imperative around universality of access, and access needs to incorporate those elements that Bex just named of, you know, affordability, reliability, the hardware to, you know, it's no use having NBN to the wall if you've got nothing to plug it into, if you can't afford a modem, and if you've got nothing for that to talk to. I think that it's really time that we reckon with the cost of the exclusion that we're naming, and happily some research will soon launch, we believe, from ACAN, which is one of the consumer advocacy, you know, peak body. And we really look forward, I mean, all of us are members of Westerly, and I think that our coalition is excited to see that research when it launches.
Absolutely. And I will return to Westerly and some of the things that Westerly has done, but I want to take us a little bit back to some of the impacts on the ground to some of the communities. So I might turn to you, Abdallah, and just ask, how did Western Sydney's refugee and migrant communities respond to working and studying from home? Was trauma an issue, and how did MYAN respond?
So when it comes to the migrant and refugee communities in Western Sydney, the reaction to work and study from home was vastly different within the group. As some of them knew how to use computers and internet, it allowed for an element of comfort, as they were able to look for jobs online and perform their jobs from home. But for a particular group, people among this group, they were able to adapt to online schooling as well and Google Classroom faster than others. So it worked well for them, and their children ended up doing well. But on the other hand, other migrants and refugees who did not have a high level of digital literacy, it was difficult for them to support their children through online schooling. Some of them did not have access to a computer, and whoever had, they did not have the essential skills to use it. So you can imagine, if they find it difficult to support their children with online schooling, it would be much more difficult to find a job during the pandemic and work or study online from home. When it comes to the trauma and mental health, unfortunately, most of the migrant and refugee communities, especially the newly arrived ones, they do not have the courage to express how they feel and talk about the trauma they went through. So they always try to deal with it and escape from those issues by connecting with their friends and families, and this becomes their coping mechanism. So during the pandemic and the lockdown, a lot of them have lost the connections they had, which makes overcoming the mental health issues and the trauma just a longer process.
Yeah.
And I think here comes the importance of the role that organizations play when it comes to raising awareness about those issues and giving this work a priority. So at MYAN New South Wales, during the first lockdown, we've noticed that a lot of our young people do not have the access to any tech assets. So they are missing out on the education and accessing the services they needed. So we've tried to support them, and this task took precedence. So it was a new role for MYAN, but we had to prioritize it. So we used some brokerage money to support young people with tech assets. We have applied for different grants. The Department of Communities and Justice, DCJ, offered a limited number of laptops. We have submitted some applications on behalf of our young people, but unfortunately we were not successful with any application, and they've received more than 6,000 applications. So this shows the need and the lack of access to technology within the community. We did a community call out too, and we ended up sourcing some computers and laptops that had to be picked up from different locations across Sydney area. And then we dropped them off at one of our young people who's a MYAN youth ambassador and a refugee too. So he volunteered his time to refurbish all the devices, download all the softwares that students may need to use. And once that was done, we just picked them up again and delivered them to our young people across Western Sydney. And this has somehow just improved the digital access.
Oh, that's absolutely fabulous. I wasn't aware of that program, and I'm sure a lot of people listening here today would be really interested in hearing about that, and hopefully you'll be able to get some more and we can connect more young people.
I hope so.
Yeah, but Beck, I think it'll be largely the same in your experience, I would imagine, in terms of the importance of digital access and literacy among your communities. But I would like to hear a little bit about perhaps a little story, of, one story of someone in the community, and perhaps then a little bit about what Westerly's doing and what Westerly is.
Sure. There's so many stories, but many of them sort of boil down to very similar things, which is, for example, we heard a lot of stories of a single parent or even two parents, but stuck at home with 5 kids with one mobile phone between them, expected to somehow do online learning for those kids. There were so many stories like that during COVID, but, even prior to COVID, more and more kids are expected to do assignments online and submit them online. And so many of the families we're working with just don't have access to either tech or the online space to do that. So, as we've said, it existed before COVID and it's just been really enhanced through COVID. I mean, one of my own staff members uses mobile data because she can't afford a fixed internet plan, because the monthly ones are so expensive. But she ends up spending so much money on that mobile data. And if we have a Zoom meeting, it chews it up so quickly. So there's lots of people like in her situation who want to engage in meetings, community meetings, but just can't because their mobile internet is unreliable and expensive, and just goes just like that. So there's so many stories like that, even where sort of kids are able to get online and do some online schooling. It's very hard if the parents don't know how to help them in that online space. I mean, I know even in my own home, we really struggle with Google Classrooms and all the different platforms you're meant to use. And I have to admit, very, very little online schooling got done in my house during COVID. And when talking with people in Mount Druitt, it was a very similar situation, but for different reasons. And Westerly, sorry. So, I mean, bringing all the groups together, all the different agencies together to form Westerly has been one of the easiest things that I've ever done. And the reason is because every single agency I was speaking to was facing the same problems, really struggling with that disconnect between residents who they normally were contacting face-to-face or were dropping in. So, yeah, a whole bunch of us got together and formed a coalition. We're still really working through what that means and how we work together and what we're specifically asking for. But as I said before, I think the broad thrust of what we're trying to do is have different conversations with a whole bunch of different groups, including the Department of Education and telecommunications and social housing providers. We're looking to have that broad communication with them about how can we solve this problem. So we're not just wanting to sort of point at government and say, you need to do better, you need to give us more money. We're really wanting to be part of the solution. We're really wanting to do some planning and some research and have some discussions from the ground up. We don't claim to have all the answers, but we really want to push that conversation and push for things that we think need to see happen. And I think one of the strengths of our coalition is that most of us are pretty on the ground organisations who are really embedded in our communities. We work from strengths-based approaches and we really want to have the voices of our communities heard and their experiences listened to moving forward.
Oh, thank you. And Jane, I know that you're a Westerly member and you do a lot of work in the grassroots on the ground. So I would like to ask you as well, what are some of the stories relating to a lack of digital access that you've seen? And what innovative solutions have you been involved in to support communities to access digital software and get online?
Mm-hmm. We've done a lot of brokerage, so I don't know that we've necessarily innovated. We haven't created a new program or new ways of connecting. We've looked for how people already are using technology and where the limits of that lie. And we've used the post. We've kind of gone old school. For instance, we run a language writing academy for people who speak Arabic but can't write it. And so we were literally posting out the materials, to participants. It did involve a digital element, so we were looking to remove any barriers to access, but the limits of how we've delivered our program meet the constraints, I guess, of the participants and their connectivity, which in many cases is quite limited. So in terms of the stories that we've been hearing, by nature of our presence in the community, we interact a lot with women and children, because we run a children's bookshop. So the people who tend to run through our doors are the children, dragging their mothers closely behind them, when we're open, of course, and we haven't been open since the 16th of March. So the very first thing that we did was reach out to more than 100 people connected to our programming to survey precisely, this question: how connected are you? How affordable is it? What have you got? What kind of devices? And as we continued to have those conversations, we started to hear stories from mums who talking about, look, if this were in my language, if I had to be the teacher of my kids, fine, but it's not. This is in English and that's not my first language. And I feel overwhelmed, out of my depth. I'm not feeling good. I'm not feeling able to help my kids. People talking a lot about feeling overwhelmed with the weight of educating their children, which I think is a universal feeling. So many parents have talked about that. But I think when you're trying to do it in a language that's not your own, that's a whole other story. We've also heard, we know that part of the issue in this space about getting connected is that people on a lower income or who are unable to get a postpaid plan, like $60 a month, and you pay it after you've used the service, are using prepaid or are relying on mobile data, which is the most expensive way of buying your data. So there's quite a high percentage of the people in our community who talked about, well, this smartphone here is the only way we have to connect to the internet. We know that schools did a really good job. Some of the schools in our region have done great work in connecting people who were otherwise disconnected to the internet. And with dongles that the Department of Education made available and devices as well. So we were doing a lot of that work, advocating to kind of connect people up to schools, to CLOs and to principals and assistant principals to try and connect the gaps, I guess. We do have a fleet of a small number of laptops, but it was difficult to know how to prioritise giving out. Let's say we have 20, who do we give them to? Because the need was so much greater, and we didn't really have the capacity to support them. Like we don't run a help desk. We didn't have the depth of capacity to do that. So what Westerly has tried to do together, we've researched where you can buy affordable refurbished equipment if you can't afford to buy equipment outright, and we've tried to work with the local schools. I guess that's the system. There's no lack of goodwill, and the Department of Education saw this coming down the line, and they have an equity committee. But it really depends on the advocacy and efficacy of a principal. So if you have a visionary principal who's willing to put their equity budget on the line and, buy up what's available from the local, wherever they go, then those kids had a solution, those families had a solution. But for people who were perhaps, caught off guard or didn't have a lot of budget left, those communities weren't as well served. And I guess we're just saying, is that the kind of roll of the dice that we want to? It's not equitable. That we need to have a kind of bigger systems view of how to ensure equity to this type of technology, so that we're not hearing these stories of families who feel that they're just sort of left on their own, crying for better social support talking about, you know, like IT is not my thing, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's to echo really everything that Abdallah and Beck have already talked about. Only that I think there's a language capability that we need to remember, particularly in Western Sydney. I mean, around us, more than 7 out of 10 people are speaking languages other than English at home. And that's part of the great diversity and assets of the community. But that wasn't recognised really adequately enough in the solution. And so that's something that we, in particular, want to continue to talk about. And I guess there's a gender dimension to this as well, in terms of, you know, where the burden fell. A lot of the time it was on women to become educators. You know, that's, well, it could be a biased sample, but that's what we heard strongly.
Thanks, Jane. And a lot of what you said resonated with me on a personal level too, because I mean, it was challenging for all of us. With children being homeschooled, and, you know, we were all fighting over what devices we had at home, and, you know, all of that. And it's just a nightmare. But some of the things you talk about in terms of action, I think you've got ESP, because we got a question from the audience, from Anonymous, and I might throw it to you, Jane, I think, after this, but given the importance of digital access and what we know about digital inclusion, what will it take for government policy to lead the way and support digital inclusion at local, state and federal levels? ? Go beyond and look at universal access.
Yeah. Is that the last part of the question? What does universal access look like?
I suppose it would be good if you could talk a little bit about that, but what will it take to get the government on board and look at universal access at all levels of government?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the question. That is precisely the question. I'm sure Abdallah and Beck should feel free to jump in, but I guess I think it's really putting digital inclusion front and centre as a vehicle for inclusion. Like, the government can't, like federally, for instance, the federal government can't on one hand say, we expect you as a beneficiary of taxpayer dollars to go looking for a job, if they don't, with the other hand, say, and here's the tools with which to do it. You know, that's just one example. You can't place a compliance burden without also understanding that people need the tools with which to solve the problem that they're facing. And the internet is clearly front and centre, part of that equation. I mean, you only have to look at the turn that is happening at all levels of government to be digitally, you know, to digitise their own service provision, to digitise their own interface with citizens and service users, such that, you know, almost everything that you would expect to have one day to have had to line up at the post office to complete, or an RMS, now Services New South Wales, or the Passport Office, etc. You know, regardless of which level of government, whether it's your rates or a passport application with the Commonwealth Government, or something to do with the state government, your driver's licence, all of that can be done pretty well online if you're connected. If you're not, you'd better clear your diary and to stand in line, you know, and there's a reason why, you know, the incidence of high income households are associated with many, many devices, with high speed internet. There's a reason why people pay to have a premium to have high speed internet connected to their homes and premises, because it makes life easier. It makes life faster. It makes life more efficient. It means that you spend less of your time waiting and more of your time getting on with being, you know, having efficacy, enjoying the benefits of that. So I think it's just about changing the tenor of conversation about what we expect of government, and also the utility of the internet, that it's a right. It needs to be framed as something which is necessary. As Beck was saying, it's a utility. It's something to which, if you have access, you are able to participate, and if you don't, you're not. So as a society, we need to reckon with whether that matters. Of course, we say it does. And I think that, you know, you could make a similar argument about if we say that attending school, it matters. If we say that completing school matters. If we say that voting or being counted in the census, do those things matter? Increasingly, then we have to stand up to what a universal service guarantee means in real terms. It's not enough to have that in legislation, which we do now at the Commonwealth level. We need to actually interrogate what it means in terms of I can access the internet, I can afford it, it doesn't drop out, and I have something to use it with. And moreover, I know how to use that thing that connects to the internet. And then it's a question of accountability. So really, I feel that it's about all of us raising our voices and demanding more, you know, that it's not enough that it exists. We should all be able to access it.
Absolutely. And I'd like to invite Beck and Abdallah also to have, if they have something to say in regards to what can we do to get local, state and federal governments together on this to go beyond talk and look at universal access.
I'm just going to speak based on my lived experience as a refugee who went through the same process as other refugees and migrants. And I would say that we have some great programs that already exist, but we can somehow improve them. For example, we can invest in digital literacy through the Adult Migrant English Program, the MEP program, and the IEC, the Intensive English Centers. And we can make, I know the focus is English language, digital literacy is equally important. So if we can invest in both learning English and at the same time developing the digital literacy levels, that would, as Jane mentioned, that would make their life much easier. First, they would be able, let's say, pay bills online, do everything online. At the same time, that would increase their employability and they would be able to contribute to the Australian community just way faster. So it would enhance their whole resettlement experience.
Yeah, I really like that around learning both at the same time. And I think that, I guess it speaks to my earlier point about needing to see it in a holistic way and needing to help the government understand that we're not just asking them to sort of deliver a brand new costly program. We're asking them to have a conversation with us so that we can build this into things that are already happening in our own communities and build those place-based solutions, because that's how it's going to work anyway. We know that if governments and MPs hear these stories from lots of different places, that they're more likely to listen. So we, you know, like Jane said, it's about everyone trying to get involved and share their stories. You know, if MPs are hearing it from people they're talking to in the street, as well as the local schools, as well as local community organisations, they're going to be hearing the same message, which is that yes, this is no longer a nice to have. This is something that has become essential for daily life, and it's something that governments are requiring people to use for MyGov, for Centrelink, for tax, for everything. So they can't, like Jane said, they can't say that on one hand, but then not provide the means of access on the other. So yeah, I think it's about, as it always is in campaigning, it's about putting pressure on and it's about having those conversations. But I think really key for us is wanting to be part of the solution, not just wanting to point fingers and demand money, but wanting to be part of those solutions and part of those conversations.
Thanks, Beck. And I think all three of you have given some really good examples of how agencies on the ground or even peak youth organisations have been there at the forefront of supporting communities and things. We've had a question from our YouTube channel. So I would like to invite Charlton to read that out.
Thanks, Anita. So we've actually got a question from Morgana from YouTube, who asks, working and studying from home doesn't seem to factor in adequate workspaces. What role can public space play for those who don't have enough office or quiet space at home?
Great question.
So good.
I mean, we're having a discussion within the frame of Westerly about public Wi-Fi settings, and what would it look like if Wi-Fi were optimised for access rather than to delimit, you know, like well, either as a way of getting you into the shopping mall, but then making it, you know, 30 megabytes, so that, you know, you can only do a very little small amount of browsing. The moment you start to download anything, you're kicked off. Public transport has similar limits. So I guess there's a question around whether, you know, we can come up with a protocol or a set of principles, and also the skills for people to shape their own Wi-Fis to maximise access, you know, because it doesn't actually cost you anything if you've got unlimited data to let more people on your network, and there are ways of shaping that so that your own internal network usage isn't affected. That's what we do, and I think it would be wonderful to see larger organisations and people who hold large amounts of public space, like Westfield Shopping Centre, you know, shopping centre providers, local councils, libraries, of course, part of that network, doing that so that it doesn't ever get turned off, and people can use, you know, the space that is all of ours, but still access something that doesn't really cost. There's no real opportunity cost. There's no real cost for keeping your modem on, you know, other than, I mean, you're already incurring the cost. Maybe there's a couple of cents of electricity in there. Yeah.
But part of that is about breaking down those barriers between different organisations and different telcos and different brands and different, sites of exclusion, I guess, as Jane was saying, we want to open up that conversation so that there can be more, you know, sharing the cost of that. If the cost is fairly marginal to create those public Wi-Fi spaces, and that cost can be shared across, for example, social housing providers, businesses, telcos, and the government, if those could be shared, the costs would be fairly minimal and very doable in our opinion. So it's a great question. I think that is something we should be working towards, and it's part of the conversation.
Abdallah, would you like to add anything to that around public space and accessing the digital space in public space?
Yeah, I think this is something that we definitely should look into, and I think it would be doable and achievable through the collaboration between the larger organizations and the venues. But I just thought when it comes to that, we also need to think about doing it and keeping it COVID safe, like implementing that with all the social distancing rules. For example, accessing the library is very difficult now. You have to book it and it's only available for an hour. So we have to keep that in mind too. So how we can collaborate with the other organizations and at the same time, keep in mind, keeping it COVID safe and providing equitable access to everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you to whoever tuned in and asked that question. It was a really good question. We do have another question which I'd like to ask before we wrap up today. What do you think is the feasibility of schools offering extra assistance, support, compassion, etc. to children post-COVID, i.e. the families that have lower levels of digital access and literacy, and may lead to the children having poorer test scores, poorer school performance, and so forth? Also, is there an option for people who have access to internet data to gift some of it to people who don't have access? So there's two questions there. What's the feasibility of schools providing that extra assistance to people post-COVID, particularly those who have lower levels of digital access and literacy? And then also, is it possible to gift someone some internet data? Beck, do you want to go first?
Sure. I just want to be upfront that I'm certainly, maybe should have been an upfront earlier, that I'm certainly not an expert in the IT space. So in terms of gifting your data to someone else, I believe it's possible, but I'm not exactly sure how that works. But wouldn't it be great to have programs set up so that that was able to happen? You know, my understanding is that there aren't many programs available that kind of facilitate that process. In terms of schools offering that extra support, my understanding from the schools that we've been sort of working with is that they are just slammed. They are absolutely slammed, and they are, like the rest of us, on a massive learning curve. So I think it has to actually come from beyond the schools. I think that support has to come from higher up within the Department of Education and maybe other parts of government, because the schools were just doing their very best to do what they needed to do to get through COVID. Now kids are back at school, but still facing some of those difficulties. And those difficulties are going to continue. Kids are missing a bit more school than they used to, because if they have a runny nose, they have to stay home. Or if someone else in their family has a runny nose, they all have to get tested and whatnot. And like we said, kids were already being required to do lots of things online. So there's already a lot of kids being left behind in that online space. And I really think that, you know, a lot of the work that's gone on during COVID has been super ad hoc in schools and in, you know, other, say, certain charities had partnerships with, or certain partnerships with certain businesses. So, you know, their clients might get a device or whatever, but there was certainly nothing across the board. There was nothing that you could tap into for a disadvantaged family that you knew, unless they were already a client of a particular charity. And so I guess what I'm arguing is that in terms of education, in terms of the broader community, it needs to come from higher up. There needs to be a more coordinated and comprehensive program that kind of encompasses everyone based on need, not kind of based on what school you're a member of or what charity you're a member of or who you're a client of. It really needs to be a lot more comprehensive than that. That would be my view.
Can I add to that? I feel like, yeah, those are really great points, Beck. And I feel that there's from the bottom up as well. Like, for instance, we run a homework club that obviously that's bilingual and relies on our staff and volunteers. And yeah, we're lucky. We've got a big body of volunteers who speak a lot of languages. So we're able to kind of offer something that's relevant. But that could be emulated, you know, in most community settings. If you draw on, you know, the students in need will reflect the community around you, and there could well be people. That's a model that we could share. I think there are other ways, like I know that, for instance, in, you know, people who are into gaming, for instance, if they live locally, might create mesh networks and share their own data, like create local area networks. Yes, you have to have some IT, but there's a lot of help on YouTube. And there's probably, you know, great community-based groups that can help you learn how to configure networks safely if you're lucky enough to be able to afford unlimited data. So that's one thing you could do, especially if you live, because I think something that characterises this city is that people live cheek by jowl with people without. So ways that we can think about throwing our own networks more widely are likely to benefit someone who can't afford the access that we might be able to if you're in that position. Yeah, no, I think that's it. Just that, like, there might be, you know, community mechanisms as well that might support those children. Oh, and as for the gifting of data, I agree with Beck. It would be fantastic if there was an easier untied mechanism, but I don't know that you can. I know that there's, you know, one of the leading telco providers is advertising, you know, donate your data, but that's already in a tie-in with one of the family charities. So it's not like anyone can apply for that data. So it would be fantastic if there were a greater pool. It's also a fallacy, though, in terms of the market itself, as in it's a shaping of what's actually available. you know, and the incremental cost of providing more data in a fixed network like NBN is very, very small. So it wouldn't actually cost the telco provider money to make more data available. What costs them is the speed.
Well, that's really interesting. Abdallah, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing, that I think we have a lot of youth service providers that focus on education, and they already have lots of great programs like homework centers. So schools could collaborate with those organizations and service providers where they could, because schools at capacity, so those externals could run the homework centers for an hour or two after schools and support the schools and the students with that.
Yeah.
Oh, great idea. I need to rush us along. It's such an interesting conversation. I don't want to interrupt to rush us along, but just very quickly, Gary Kachia has put a comment forward just to say some of the people here might be interested in checking out the Zoom Academy. He sent a link to a YouTube site, but it's the Zoom Academy. Unfortunately, I can't share that link with you, but yeah, have a look, and hopefully someone can put it on our YouTube channel. But in closing, I'd like to ask each one of you, what is one piece of advice you could give our audience today to make a practical difference in the lives of communities needing better access to digital infrastructure and connectivity? So just looking for one piece of advice. I'll start with Abdallah.
So for refugees and migrant communities, I would say we could invest in digital literacy and make that as part of the programs that are already offered, as that would make a great difference for them.
Great. And Jane?
I'm struggling to come up with one recommendation. I guess if you're an organisation, consider joining Westerly to be part of the advocacy. And as individuals, I guess, thinking on how to democratise your own access, you know, like I just discussed, sharing Wi-Fi. I have a long list, but that's where I've arrived. That's my one recommendation.
Fantastic. And Beck?
I would really echo that. I think if you're not already doing this, maybe start to take notice of the issue a bit more, start to notice what's happening within your networks and communities, notice the groups that maybe are missing out. If you can see that it's an issue that's affecting the people you work with or care about, then get involved. Yep, join Westerly, become part of the conversation. And just quickly, you know, if you know about computers and you have the time to help someone learn about computers, volunteer for an organisation like LEAP. They're part of Westerly, but they do great work doing one-on-one mentoring. So something like that, or volunteer with what Jane's doing over there or what Abdallah's doing, you know, with those networks that are already on the ground, kind of helping people.
Thank you so much. Look, what you guys have spoken about today and what we already know from all the community members that we're seeing is that digital access and literacy are just some key issues now. They've always key issues for Western Sydney, but they've just come to the fore now. They're just in your face. This is the way we're all engaging. So let's make sure that our society can engage, you know, and to do that, I think Westerly, through agencies like Bidwill Uniting, Think+Do, Tank, MYAN, you know, through those agencies and a lot more, certainly doing some great work and great advocacy. And Western Sydney Community Forum has joined that campaign. So you should watch this space. They're going to launch their website and a briefing paper really soon. So definitely watch this space, and I'm really excited by that and the possibilities, but let's make sure our people in Western Sydney can access what they need to access to participate in society. So that was really clear. And I think there's been some really practical solutions that have come out of today's discussion. So thank you to all of you for sharing that. And again, Beck, that was a great idea. If you have IT skills or whatever, share those with people. If there's a way that, I don't even know if I can legally say if you can share your data with people or whatever, but do that. I don't know. I'm a lawyer, so it's all good.
Not legal advice, it's just a hunch.
Yeah. But you know what I want to do? I want to thank each of you. So thank you so much to Beck Reidy for joining us today as a panelist. Look forward to chatting with you in the near future about how to progress Westerly. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to also thank Abdallah, Altibi again, and MYAN. Thank you so much for joining us today, and definitely keep advocating for those migrant and refugee young people, and Western Sydney Community Forum would be happy to work with you anytime to do that. So thank you, Abdallah. And also thank you to Jane Stratton from the Think+Do tank for joining us. You raised some really critical points, and I'm certain that a lot of people have a lot to think about now going forward. But thank you, Jane.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. So look, I know that some of you put some questions forward, and we won't be able to follow up those questions today, but we will follow them up separately and hopefully share that YouTube link that Gary shared with us. I need to remind you that Western Sydney Community Forum has a range of COVID-19 services to support the community sector in Greater Western Sydney. Please check out our website. There's a lot there, including our Q&A portal where you can send questions to experts on different subjects. Always feel free to contact us for any further support that you might need, or questions, or anything. But just want to say thank you all for attending and asking your great questions. It's time for me to say goodbye. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.